Hi, my name's Dan, and in this video we're going to go over using the BookStack API with the Node.js. We're going to focus on doing a few specific activities, and along the way we'll get a handle for the basics of using the API. This guide assumes some previous knowledge of JavaScript and Node.js. I'm not going to delve too much into those things, but I'm going to be starting fairly from scratch so you can kind of follow the full process. We jump into the my code editor. I've got PHP Storm open here with an index.js file and just some comments of what we're going to look to achieve. So we're going to list out the books in our BookStack instance and get the first one. Then we're going to create a new page within that book. Then we're going to update that page, and then we're going to delete the page. So just going through a set of common actions that you might want to do by the API. And on the right hand side here I have my terminal window. So you can see I've got Node installed. It's the latest LTS version. And I can Node index.js to run that file. If I just add a console.log cat, then that will log out cat when I run that file. What I'm going to do for the purposes of this guide is I'm going to npm install nodemon. And then once that's installed, instead of coming over to the terminal each time and running that file, nodemon instead of Node.js and passing in that file, we'll just run that file each time it's saved. So if I tweak this to cats, it'll output cats. So just so we got a constant output of whatever I save to save within this file. Save that again, nothing in there, so no new output. If I jump over to my BookStack instance, this is a fairly fresh BookStack instance, and I'm logged in as the default admin user. There's not much in here, but I've just created a initial book, chapter, and page, just so we've got some content that will be visible via the API, just to ensure we're not on a completely empty instance. So we're not going to be using anything too special within this. But we will be using one library, and that's Axios, and that's just to make sure make the HTTP request to the BookStack API to make that part of things a bit easier, and to use some of the nice stuff that Axios has built in, which we'll see a bit later on. Okay, all right, I think that's everything. So let's get started. So the first action is list out books and get the first one. So we need to get started with the API really. What we can do, if we go to edit profile for our current user, then assuming our current user has API permissions, which this user does because we're using an admin user, you'll see this box down the bottom of the user profile. We've got a link here for the API docs, so we can open that up in a new tab. And then you've got full detail here, including authentication, and all the API endpoints. So the task was to list out the books and get the first one. So we can see in down here, we'll look for books, and then there's a list endpoint. This is get a listing of books visible to the user. So this is what we want. We want to make an API request to this URL. So let's just copy that in. So we've got that for reference. So we're going to need to make an API request to this, but first we need to install Axios actually. So if I open up a new terminal window, or npm init y to create a package.json file. There we go. And I'll do npm install save and then Axios, so we get Axios as a dependency. There we go, there's Axios. And then I'll import that in. So const Axios equals require Axios. Cool. All right, now let's attempt to get the data from this API endpoint. So we'll do Axios, and it was a get endpoint. So we'll do a get request, and then we'll cut that out and add that in there. And then we'll do all the response. So log, and then we can get the data from that response by doing the response.data, which is just how Axios provides the data on the responses that it gives you. And this is all promise-based, and we'll clean this up a little bit later. So if I close this terminal, save that, and then it's giving us an error at the moment, but we can see the data on the response here. Again, a 401, no authorization token found on the request because we're not authenticating with the API. BookStack doesn't know who we are, so it's not letting us access the data. Okay, so if we go up to the authentication section of the docs, the API authentication format is quite simplistic. Essentially, we just need to pass an authorization header that has a value of token space, a token ID, and a token secret. So if I copy that out and just put this in to our request, so with Axios we can pass a second parameter in our get request, which is the options for the request. Then here we can pass headers under a headers property, and this takes a key value object of the header names to header values. So just paste in what I copied from the docs. So it's an authorization header, and the value is essentially this. I'll get rid of that comment. But of course, it's not just having token ID in angle brackets. We need to actually get a token ID and a token secret. So within our BookStack instance, if I'll do that in the new tab, go back to my profile, and go back down to that section we found earlier, we'll create a new API token for this user. I'll give it a name. I'll just call it demo. There we go, my demo API token. And something to note with the API tokens is that they'll be applicable to the user that you're creating them for. So if we generate an API token for this admin user, when I use that with the API, I'm then going to be acting as that admin user via the API. So I'll have all the same permissions and abilities as that admin account. So if you're doing a more simplistic integration where your focus is quite narrow, you may only need to do certain read activities from the API. What's probably safe to do is to create an API specific user and create a token for them. So you're not giving them more privileges than they need, just in case those tokens get they get found by the users. There's a vulnerability or whatever. Just to make sure they have the least possible privileges needed for their usage. But here we're just playing around, so we'll do one for the admin user. And then you can set an expiry date if you want the token to no longer be valid after a certain amount of time. But here we're just going to leave that as the default, which gives it 100 years of use, which should be fine for our purposes. So we'll hit save, and then we'll get the token ID and the token secret here. Something to consider is this token secret won't be shown again at all. It's not stored in BookStack. You can't get this back. You'd have to delete the token and create a new one if you kind of forget this value. So make sure you store that safe if it's in use. Let's copy our ID. We'll place ID in here. And then we'll do the same for the secret. So we'll copy that. And then place that in here. Cool, so that's our header set. So if I save this, and we'll see if this now runs. Cool. So this made the API request, and we can see we're getting back our data, which is what I'm console.logging out here. So you can see it returns an object with a data property that has an array of the items, or array of books in this case. We've got one book in here, which we're seeing here, my first book, which is the one that we saw within the interface. So that's how we're fetching that out. That all seems to be working quite nicely. So the next step is going to be creating a page within our book. So it'll be best to dynamically get that ID from the results. But I'm just going to do a few steps of cleanup to what we've already got. So first of all, I'm going to wrap this up because this is all promise based. We're using .then. We could create a big promise chain for each of these, but it might get a bit messy. So it'll be nice to use a new sort of JavaScript async await syntax. So that's what we'll do here. We'll just wrap this in an async function, which will immediately invoke. And then what that means, if we just copy all of this within here, we'll do everything. We can then use await within here, so we can change the syntax to be const response equals await that, and then we'll move that outside. Ooh, and then we can maybe do const first book ID equals rest.data ID. Oh, no, the rest of the data is an array, so we'll get the first item within the data. Actually, that's still going to be invalid because response.data is this, and we're going to be looking for the data on that. So it'll be response.data ID, and then if we console log that out, first book ID, hopefully that should return us 1. Yep, it's returning us 1. Cool. So now we're going to need to reuse a lot of this logic. So we could just copy and paste this. But what I'm going to do instead is that I'm going to use an Axios feature to kind of set a lot of these properties, or at least this header, so we don't have to repeat what we're doing here. So if we check out Axios's options, we go to config defaults, you see you can set all these options, including the headers. You can set default options for the global Axios instance, but I don't really want to do that because if we then use Axios for something else, it might then affect that usage. But what we can do is create a custom instance with default options set. So we'll use this kind of technique to create our own Axios instance for our BookStack usage. So we'll go const API is what I'll create the object as. Do Axios.create. Then in here will be our default options. So I'll cut and paste my headers into there. I'm going to set a timeout, because by default Axios doesn't have a timeout. So if something doesn't return in time, or if it just constantly pauses, then Axios will wait forever. But by just setting a sensible timeout of like 3 seconds like we are now, it means we won't get stuck in those loops. And then what we can also do in here, as shown within here, with Axios you can provide a base URL. So we'll do the same here. Base URL, then our base API URL is this one. And then within here we can just say, we just get /books. But now instead of using Axios.get, we'll need to use our instance.get. So we'll reference that variable that we created there. So we can now call API getBooks. We don't need this config. It's all done in our API instance. So let's save this and see if it still works. Cool, we're still getting our first book ID of 1, which is what we expect. I'm just going to rename this as well to be, what we can do actually is get the data and extract that out directly. So we'll get the data and rename that to book list data, just to be a bit more descriptive, and then we can replace that there with our new book list data variable. Cool, and that's still running as we expect. Let's just tab these comments and then we can start on the next action. We'll get rid of this first book ID. So now we want to create a new page within our book. Okay, let's consult the API documentation and see what endpoint we'd be using. So we'll create a new page. Let's go down to pages, create. So within a lot of these API endpoints within documentation, there will be full examples of the response that you get back. And for things where you're needing to send data, there should be also an example of the request that you need to send. So you can see it might look something like that in terms of the data that we need to send. And for these kind of endpoints as well, there's body parameters to know what data we have available. The example request might show everything available, but it might not as well. For example, here we can send either HTML or Markdown, whereas the example is just showing it in Markdown. So this will give you a fuller picture by looking at the body parameters. We can see we need a book ID or a chapter ID by the looks of it. So we need to say where the page is going to. So that will be the book ID that we're previously fetching out with the other API request that we made. A name is required. It needs to be a string, max 255 characters. It's fine. Then we can have HTML or Markdown content. And then optionally, we can send in some tags as well. So, and this is going a post request to API/pages. So let's build that out. So again, we might want to get this data back. So we'll data, and then it'll be page create data. Kind of following what we did above. We'll use our API instance dot, and this was a post request to /pages, I believe. Just double check that. Yep. And then as a second parameter, we can pass in the data for this request. So this is where we use these parameters. So we needed a book ID. And then we can use our first book ID that we fetched above. We need a name. My new API page. And we need some content. So let's send in some HTML based content. Just create a header. And then some paragraph content. Okay, and I think that's everything which we needed. And then let's just console.log out something from this response to make sure that things get created. So we'll do console.log, and then we'll created page of ID. And so if we have a look at what the response looks like, it should be an object representing this page, including an ID property. So we can do page create data.id. So let's save and run this. We'll created page of ID 2. So it looks like it's worked, but let's double check within our BookStack instance. Go into our books, we'll go into our first book, and there we go, my new API page. And go into that, and then that's got the content that we sent in. So everything's looking pretty good there. Awesome. Right, what's the next stage? We need to update the page that we created. Should be simple enough, just following what we did before. So pages, update. So this looks to be much the same. And it's going to the API pages, and then we need to provide the ID of the page that we want to update. Which should be fine because we're logging that ID out. And there is extra detail here about what each endpoint does. So here it's saying if you provide a book ID or a chapter ID, you can essentially move that page to a different location if you have the permission to do so. But we won't do that. We'll just update the content of it. So it's a put request to the pages ID. That's what we want to do. So again, following above, we can do const. We'll map the data back again. Page update data equals await API dot, and then we want to do a put request. And we'll use template strings because we want to add in the ID. So there's pages slash and then the ID, page create data.id, like we were doing above. Cool. We'll get rid of that. We need to send in the data that we want to update it with. So then let's update this. So let's update the name. So my updated API page. And let's add some markdown content as well. Click markdown. This is a markdown heading. We'll do a new line. We'll do another new line actually. Some markdown text in bold. And I think bold is 2 asterisks, like that. Cool. And I just realized this is going to be a different page, so it'll be useful to know where that page exists, or what the ID is. So again, after here we'll do console.log updated page has an ID of, again, page updated data.id. So grab the ID of the page that we're updating. It should be the same as this page create data ID actually, but we'll use this data now that we're grabbing it. So if we save this, updated page has an ID of 3. Cool, so let's try and find something in the system with my updated API page. There we go. So yeah, and this is some markdown content. So that looks like it's working okay. The thing is, we didn't see this before it was updated, but we can see here in the revisions that we got. This is revision number 2. So if we have a look at the changes, yeah, we can see that it was different. It was as our creation before, and then we've made an update since. It was pretty quick next to each other, pretty immediately. But we were writing the code immediately. The update was made immediately after the creation, so that makes sense. Cool. And then what else do we want to do? We want to delete the page that we created. All right. So let's refer back to the API documentation. Pages delete, and delete a page, and it basically sends it to the recycle bin. So again, that's kind of the same as update, but it's a delete request, and again, it takes the ID. So we can do const data page delete. Does this, it doesn't return a response. So we're not actually expecting there to be anything in here. So we can do delete response. And we'll await, and then API dot, in this case, delete pages, and then it's let's go page update data.id to get the page that we updated. And then we don't need to send any data on there because we're just saying, hey, delete this page. And then we could get the status from this. So console.log page delete HV status is delete response dot status. Okie dokie. Then what we're going to do is just going to update, because we're not going to be able to find this in the system if it deletes fine. So we'll tweak this title that when we do the update step to my updated API page, that needs to be deleted. Just so we can try and find this, or try and look for it and make sure it doesn't exist in BookStack. If we hit save now, There we go. So we got a 200 level response from the deletion, which indicates that it should be successful. And it did have an ID of 5, but let's try and make sure that there's no page in the system with that name. So we'll look back into our book. And yeah, there's nothing with that name. So it looks like it has been successful. We could just make sure that is working. If we have a look at this page, we could cheekily get the ID of this page by, we could do an API request to list out pages and get the ID that way. If we copy this URL that pops up when you select an element within BookStack, this contains the ID. So we'll jump back into our code editor. I'm just going to comment everything else that we've done so far. And within that URL, paste that in. You can see the ID of that page was 2. So I'll change that to 2. And now I can get rid of this. And if we just run this, we should expect this page here to be deleted. So it's the My New API page, specifically that one. So we should just see one of these be deleted. So we should only see one of those. We run this. Oh, I accidentally ran that. Okay, let's try that again. Let's try with this one. So the ID here is... So that's number 3. Change that to 3 and hit save. Then we'll go back out to that book, and then yeah, then that gets rid of that one. Because that deletion is working fine. And now I'll just undo those steps, just so our whole script kind of works together again. So yeah, that covers performing a lot of these basic actions. As we went through, we listed out all books and got the first one. We created a page, then we updated that page, and then we deleted the page. And yeah, that covers most common steps. It's worth reading through the introduction section of the API documentation, this whole getting started area. There's, upon the authentication that we went through earlier, this also has details about the request format. While we're using Axios, that would generally send off the data as JSON-based requests, but you can use different types of request data depending on what you're trying to do. So you could just use standard like HTML form URL encoded formats instead of JSON. BookStack will accept both. It will also accept multi-part data. There are some endpoints which require you to send in a multi-part data format. And these are particularly ones that you need to send files to. So if we have a look at something like the attachment create endpoint, it says it in the description, but if you are uploading a file as an attachment, you have to send it as a multi-part data formatted request. So just something to keep in mind. And upon that, this section also has details upon the listing endpoints. So these are the endpoints like the first one that we did, where we list out books. There's a whole variety of different parameters that you can provide to your request URL that change behavior of the results. So you can change the amount of records that you get back. You can change where you count from, because these will typically be paging. So if you have like 1,000 different books in your system and you hit that endpoint, you would by default only receive a page of 100, and then you'd have to apply an offset of 100 to get the next page of data. You can change how they're sorted, and you can also set filters to filter the results of those. So that can provide a nice way if you're looking for something with a specific name or specific property. That can really help filter out the data. If you're specifically doing a search operation, there is a separate search endpoint which will search across all shelves, books, chapters, and pages within the system. And that's a bit more powerful for doing a cross-data search across all of the elements in your BookStack instance. And that acts very much like the search bar within BookStack itself, and it's made to be efficient in regards to searching. Upon that, there's also a section about error handling, and the format for errors provided by the API is quite standardized. So this section shows you what that looks like and what to expect when an error would be thrown. Yeah, so I think that covers the core basics of using the BookStack API, at least with Node.js. I do have a repository, API scripts. So in this GitHub repository, which I'll link in the description below, our BookStack app API scripts. Yeah, it's a bunch of different scripts written in a bunch of different languages that does a bunch of different things, just to provide a whole bunch of different examples to get you going if you need to do something. For example, if we look into this docx.to-page, each of these has its own README that will describe exactly what's required and how to run the script, or how to build the application if it's something like built in Go. So yeah, these can provide a really good starting point, or a good example if you're having real trouble with a specific action using the API. Other than that, feel free to jump into the BookStack Discord server, where we can help you get on your way if you've got stuck using the API, or if you just need a little bit of help. Just feel free to shout in there. If you need new API endpoints, they can be requested on the BookStack GitHub project. We've got coverage of most core items now with the BookStack API, but there might be a few missing corner cases. So yeah, feel free to make a request there where you can provide your example use case. Then we can consider that for adding new API endpoints for the next version of BookStack. But yeah, that's everything that I've got to show today. Good luck with getting your own API script going, and have a great day.